All right. Hello all. Welcome to our USEA Consensus Program briefing, CO2 storage optimizing large volume first mover projects by managing short and long-term security and liabilities. Today we have Steve Meltzer, consulting engineer, Michael Godek, Vice President of Advanced Resources International, and who will join us later, Nick Azalina, Assistant Director for Applied Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning at EERC. So this webinar will be moderated by our very own Mike Moore. And we also have USEA's Acting Executive Director, Mrs. Sheila Hollis, who will join us and say a few words on behalf of USEA. But first, for those who do not know me, I am Michelle Littlefield. I'm a program coordinator with the United States Energy Association Consensus Program. Just a little note about us, we are formally named Building Consensus on Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage, CCUS for short. We also call this program Consensus. This is a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, Fossil Energy, and Carbon Management. The program seeks to educate the public, policymakers, industry, and stakeholders on CCUS and carbon management technologies by hosting webinars, along with a series of monthly educational briefings, such as these, conference workshops, technical reports, and we do release monthly news clips of CCUS and carbon management related updates, such as rare earth elements and blue hydrogen. If you would like to join our mailing list, please feel free to send an email to the address at the bottom of the screen, and we'll add you as a subscriber. So at the end of this session, when all three speakers have had a chance to speak, we will have a question and answer session. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit a question, and we will address as many as we can. This webinar will also be recorded and posted to our event page along with the presentation slides, but we do appreciate you taking the time to join us live. With that, I'll pass it on to our Acting Executive Director, Mrs. Sheila Hollis. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's a tremendous pleasure to be with you today on this critically important topic that is an essential element in the considerations of moving forward as an energy society in the U.S. and beyond. What is it that USEA does? Just a moment on that. We have two primary functions. We convene and we work closely with the State Department, the Department of Energy, and with USAID to inform, educate, and provide a very significant insight into all things energy, the future of energy, and the technologies that are being applied to meet the needs and the issues associated with the development and deployment of energy. This is a classic example of our forum convening role that we play with DOE, state, and with USAID. We are active we've been active in 104 countries throughout the world, and our goal is to make the world a better place through energy. 30% of the world's population have no energy supply whatsoever, to put it in perspective. And so our staff, working with the US government and with a variety of consultants, work throughout the world to improve that situation, make energy safer, more affordable, more convenient, and more accessible throughout the world. Thank you so much to our experts for being with us. Michael Moore, I've known for many years. Steve, a pleasure to get to know you and Michael. I will be listening and enjoying every minute of it, because carbon capture is a critical element in moving forward in the development of our energy society worldwide. Thank you so much, and please enjoy this outstanding presentation. Thank you.
Sheila, thank you very much. Michelle, thank you for getting us started and out the door. But Sheila, your experiences out there give you that insight as to how valuable this piece is as the energy sector works to change and transition to the goals of a lower carbon energy type society, both domestically and internationally. This is certainly a big piece, a part of that transitioning. Today we've got Steve Meltzer from Midland, Texas. For those that don't know Steve, he's been driving the CO2 EOR conference out in Midlands for, 27 years. And I got involved with him in 2002, just under 20 years ago. Mike Godek from ARI. I've had the pleasure of working with Mike and his folks at ARI for probably about as long as well. Nick Azalina, who is not on the deck in front of us, is in transit. He will join us a little bit later. And his title has artificial intelligence specialist in it. So that should help give you an idea of the depth of where he'll be coming from. We'll talk about him more when he shows up later in the afternoon or later in the program here. What we're trying to accomplish today, we've got in the world of CO2 storage, there's I won't call it a land rush going on, but there's a lot of new interested parties that have come into this space, primarily driven by 45Q and the 45Q's value and opportunities for companies to transition with the process that allows them to maybe do this in an economical, affordable, and realistic fashion, moving CO2 from emissions into captured commodity to a stored commodity in the ground geologically. The United States has a massive amount of geologic storage capacity, and in various forms as well, in different types of processes to do this, and geographically diverse across the whole US and in Canada and Mexico as well. Like anything, the opportunities can be profiled by most desirable to least desirable. In this case, the process that you start takes a while to get to the point that you're injecting CO2. Once you start the process, you have a very long tail, very long life in this area that you've injected CO2 into. So it's going to be very important that the site selection is maybe given more priority than the actual project that will produce the CO2. So I've mentioned to people I've worked with is that at the end of the day, what you do at the end of the pipe actually is more important than what the shiny object is at the beginning of the pipe. Because if this doesn't work at the end of the pipe, you have a lot of problems. You have a lot of issues with the monies that's invested in the capture and the project and the transport, land acquisition and all that. So you certainly want to get that site selection and scoping correct. Like anything else, there'll be sweet spots, first movers. That's going on right now. There are people that understand their geology extremely well. What CO2 does in that geology becomes a whole new area of expertise. And so you might know your rocks and everything around it. You also got to understand the geophysics and geomechanics, geochemistry, what CO2 is doing down there at the same time, especially if you're going to put this down there for decades, if not centuries, and have a responsibility, somebody down the life cycle of that asset, that repository, that storage area is going to have a certain amount of liability and responsibility. And it's going to have to be proven up front before you ever put it in the ground to begin with. So people we've assembled today, these gentlemen, Steve and Mike and Nick, all have very deep expert views and experiences in this space. And like I said, when we set the notification out there, take the time to read their bios, Google them on the internet to see who these gentlemen are, and you understand why what they have to say and what they present today is the kind of information that you need to do those primary first mover site selections and what to also watch out for. Now, I'll admit this, we've got 2 hours set aside for this. Any one of the topical areas that they're going to touch on could be a whole conference in itself. So maybe this kicks off a series of things with this person. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Steve Melzer, and he's going to set us in motion.
Give me one moment, please.
Just so you know, Michelle's getting the audio connected to the video right now. About a 30-foot patch cable she's running down the hallway with.
Very close to being absolutely right.
Thank you, Mike, and wanted to thank you for putting this all together, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and the other two presenters. I want to thank U.S. Energy Association as well. I think this topic is pretty germane in this world we live in today, and I really want to express my thanks to them and the subject area to cover here with de-risking first mover secure geologic storage. I'd like to organize this and talk a little bit. Mike's already mentioned some of this, but what we think is a grand challenge to our oil and gas and certainly the coal industry as well, in trying to reduce our emissions into the atmosphere of our carbon dioxide and some of the challenges we face there. I also want to talk about the necessity of carbon capture and storage, and then adding the U in there, utilization and storage, which in my world mainly means EOR, CO2 EOR, because of the big volumes that we can handle. And I'll show you some of that. And then where we put that CO2 is really important. And we want to know there's places in the world that you can put this and it'll come back to you. And there's places it'll be very secure. We know that from our geologic backgrounds in the oil and gas industry. I want to talk about some of that. And then the idea of producing more oil is sometimes a phobia for the environmental movement. And what I want to do is talk about low carbon oil. In other words, a product, when you're storing CO2 and making oil, does create a lower CO2 footprint. And let's talk about that in some detail. And then the volumetrics and dollars involved in all of this. I think because of the dollars in capture and processing and moving the CO2 to a place to store it, we need to know that it needs to be secure siting and needs to stay down there. So where are the best sites, and why should we do those first? And then I got 3 summary slides I'd like to review with you and sort of cap the morning off, if you will. Background and the grand challenge. The industry knows it's got a challenge ahead of it, but before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the conversion factors that you'll need to have in the back of your mind. And some of you have these already, but there's a couple that are very important, and that is that about 17,500 cubic feet of CO2 equals about a ton, an English ton of CO2. And we're converting from surface volumes to mass so that we can know what's in the ground in terms of its total weight, mass, but we typically use surface volumes in our oil and gas industry. It's just the way it's always been. A metric ton's a little larger, as you know, about 10% larger, so the MCF there is 19.25. And a real handy conversion factor that you'll find that you would like to have is that about 1 million tons a year of CO2 is very close to 50 million cubic feet a day. A metric ton being a little larger and an English ton being a little smaller, about 5% former and 5% latter. So that's a real handy conversion factor. We're also dealing with about a 95% purity or greater of CO2 that we're injecting. And that's a pretty big standard, a pretty important standard to keep in mind. And if you want to interconnect to an existing pipeline, you'll probably need to meet that spec. If you're going to have an isolated injection project, you could vary from that, but those are probably not efficient in many cases. The magnitude of new CO2 injection today, and what I mean by new is the purchased CO2 injection from plants and underground sources of CO2, is somewhere between 2.5 and 3 BCF a day, or about 50 to 60 million tons per year. So those numbers are pretty handy to have in the back of your mind. So back to that dual challenge. I want to tip my hat to the National Petroleum Council for tackling this subject with a huge mass of volunteers to help in writing several reports. This happens to be volume 1, where they were talking about a roadmap to large-scale deployment of carbon capture and use and storage. I tend to use the word utilization instead of use, but that's mean the same thing. And they went through a very lengthy discussion of this, and I recommend these reports, not only this volume 1, but the other volumes as well. Very, very, very thoroughly done study. The API is also in this space, of course, the American Petroleum Institute, and you see the quote here, the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's really signaled the industry needs and commitment to working with the administration to shape this lower carbon future. And I think that's a fair statement, certainly with the majors and most of the large independents too, and even the small guys are figuring this out as well in the oil and gas industry, and there's lots of those. So Occidental was one of the first to recognize this challenge, and they came out with our net zero plan here last year, maybe it was a year before now. And this quote out of Vicki Hollub, their CEO, was, I thought, really good. She believes in 15 or so years they're going to be making more money from carbon management for the oil and gas. As you know, they're probably the largest CO2 EOR producer in the world, and they see this vision that they can store enormous amounts of CO2 and make a low carbon oil while doing that. So let's talk about CCS versus CCUS a bit. Many refer to CCS as the umbrella term, carbon capture and storage, and I kind of tend to narrow that down to CCS being the storage into a deep saline aquifer, deep saline formation, and therefore CCS means something less than using it as a commodity. It's a waste product injection, whereas CCUS, you're trying to convert the CO2 into something you can sell and produce a product while doing it. And you know, it's not just EOR that fits that bill. You can do it with natural gas, and you can do it with cement, perhaps, and make cement out of anthropogenic CO2. So the captured waste injection that we've been talking about for a long time now in the DOE community has led to some projects to date, but all at small scale and none with producing wells. And so what you're doing is you're adding mass to the subsurface and not removing mass. And so that's why CCS is a different thing in my mind than CCUS, where we're actually producing a product and we're making room, if you will, for the CO2 that goes into a reservoir in the case of EOR. And because we're removing things and because we want to cap our pressures that we have in our reservoirs, we surveil the performance of that reservoir. We know where the CO2 is and know where it's going. And we've been doing this for 40 or 50 years now with the observation by the state oil and gas regulatory agencies, and SAGRAs, I guess you can call them. And we have been doing this to a degree now where we are exceeding 20 trillion cubic feet of total CO2 injected and made, that's about 400 billion metric tons, and we made about 2 billion barrels of oil. The current rates of that purchased new CO2, the non-recycled CO2 in an injection project, all the projects combined total about 2.5 billion cubic feet a day, or 50 million tons a year. So when I say non-recycled, what I mean is that these are closed loop systems. We tend to end up at the end of a project, we've ended up recycling as much or maybe a little bit more than we bought of the new CO2. And there were folks that said, well, we only store half of what we inject. And that's really a misleading statement, because we store nearly everything we buy, and that's what matters. And we recycle some of that CO2 because it comes back with the oil and water that we produce. Now, if there are times when the electricity goes out to our compressors and we do vent, we flare it basically because we've got to add methane to the recycle stream in order to flare it. And so we hate that because we're losing energy, we're losing money on methane we could sell. So literally, we we try to minimize that. But some of those factors are out of our control with the electricity delivery to our fields. But it doesn't happen frequently. Fortunately, it's very infrequent. So that when we look at projects like SACROC or the Denver unit in West Texas, we know we've stored about 95% or better of the CO2 that we purchased. That's a big number to remember. So we're not perfect, but we're close to it. Now, if you look at the environmental movement, what we see is we see a number of the folks in that industry that recognize that we continue to need hydrocarbons, and we're going to combust those hydrocarbons, so we're going to have CO2 emissions. And so what the world needs to have is the lowest emission profile. And so if we can reduce that emission profile by storing CO2 while we combust or while we make the oil, for example, that's the desirable direction we need to go. And if there's nowhere to put that CO2, we'll be in very dire straits, as this quote from Climate Week says. So that's why CCS. You note the scales on the left in billions of tons per year up to 1 billion, and then the scale on the right, which is in BCF per day, up to 50 billion cubic feet a day. And we'll put that in perspective with this lowermost down here. This current volumes of CO2 storage from EOR is about 2.5, 3 BCF a day. And so it gives you an idea of the size of the challenge we've got ahead of us from today till 2050. So we'll talk a little bit about a big project that's been announced and at least aspirationally announced in the Gulf Coast, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes and put it on this scale as well. So this is the grand challenge, and there are a lot of people that believe we need to be capturing these levels of CO2 and putting them away in underground storage. So where do we put it? Let's put it in the right geologies. We know there's places we can put it where it comes right back. So it's a buoyant fluid in the ground, and so it can migrate to the surface and find a pathway to the underground sources of drinking water. And so we don't want that to happen because it might bring some things with it. And so we need to put it where it's securely sealed and it's there for ages. We see we need CCS for our future, and we're dealing with very large volumes. Now the thing that we've got to think about is that these plants where we're going to capture the CO2 are going to add a lot of equipment, a lot of separation facilities, and it's going to be expensive. So they need to know that their storage site they're going to send this expensive CO2 to is going to be a low risk idea, and that'll justify their capture, processing, and transportation expenses to those sites. And moving CO2 from a plant to a low-risk secure site is also expensive. So the longer that site is, the further that site is from a secure site, then obviously what they've got to do is balance the risks of a nearby site with a higher risk storage site with a long pipeline perhaps, or maybe cooperate on a low pipeline to a very low risk set of secure sites. And the more secure sites you have, the better off your reliability is going to be in taking that CO2. And these sites that are secure are not everywhere. We've seen a lot of work in the literature about leaky wellbores, and we have a few of those, and we fixed them, and the industry has fixed those very readily. Very few studies are out there to categorize leaky geologies. And so I found one about 20 years ago. I thought it was really well done. And I'm going to show you 2 slides from a report that attempted to rate those subsurface basins and sites for suitable storage. what they did is they put it into a framework of the plate movements. In other words, these tectonic plates where they're moving around the globe, sometimes they're converging and forming mountains, as you see on the left, and then sometimes they're diverging, as you see on the right. And the examples of the divergent basins are the one they thought were the ones that had the secure site profile. So the Foreland Basin is an example of that. Would be the Denver-Julesburg Basin there in eastern Colorado and Wyoming. And then the Cratonic Basin, the examples of those I'll show you in a minute are basically they're a sag, if you will, in the crust. And then they're oftentimes capped with salts and hydrites. And then you've got the divergent passive margin basins like the Gulf Coast as potentially secure sites. Now those are regional concepts, and clearly the local nature of the target site needs to be examined in detail to be sure that it is a secure storage site. Now, I mentioned that the cratonic basins are usually evaporite capped, and the reason for that is their cutoff to the ocean waters gets stopped at some point, and then the water salinity increases and excuse me, and causes salt and hydrite evaporites to form, sometimes thick, and when they're at a depth of 2,500 feet or 2,000 to 3,000 feet depth, they're typically ductile and provide excellent capping seals for the reservoirs below them. And we know that from our oil entrapments in many basins around the world. So that framework, convergent and divergent basins, is something that very much matters here. They have another slide too where they looked at the risk of leakage on the left there on the ordinate axis and the degree of sediment compaction on the horizontal axis. And what you really like is good hard rocks like there on the left and a low risk site. And they categorize cratonic foreland basins as two of those. Interior rift, kind of in the middle, divergent passive margin can be a good site, but you got to be careful. And then ocean sag and rich trench and associated active margins have both higher risk and low compaction in the sediments. Low compacted sediments mean the seals are a little more likely to rupture and leak, or the capillary entry pressure is lower, so that you can actually leak CO2 small molecules out through the seal. And so those are the kind of things that they brought out in this report, which was referenced on that last slide if you want to look at it deeper. So what are the site risks for storage? I think these first two are really important. We want to know what our pressures are as we increase the injection. We got to make sure that we don't exceed the seal rupture pressures, and so that reservoir seal maintenance and pressure management go hand in hand. And then wellbore integrity is really important too. We need to make sure that any wells that have penetrated the reservoir we're injecting into those are very, very well sealed. We've known some of them to leak. Sometimes they just leak to the evaporites up, above sealing the reservoir because they were ductile, but there are places that it can leak all the way to the surface or the underground sources of drinking water. Then there's this challenge of determining the lateral continuity of a reservoir. This is a big deal. And we like to think that maybe we can see the continuity of the reservoir in our 3D seismic that we might run. And yeah, to a degree we can, but it's not often perfect. And so we have found in our oil and gas industry experience through our floods that this is a big issue. We got to know that where we're injecting goes to the next well, for example, and many times it doesn't. And so the lateral continuity is irregular. It'll cause asymmetric plumes in the reservoir at worst, and it may cause high pressures even worse. And so you end up with that reservoir seal maintenance issue due to this lack of lateral continuity. Horizontal drilling and transmissive natural fracture lessons. What we've done in the recent years, last decade or more of horizontal drilling, is we've learned a lot about these things. Most of them are near vertical, and in our vertical well days, we did not see them. Very, very seldom did we encounter a near vertical natural fracture. And we have seen these and their effects in horizontal drilling these days, and it can be very, very important. And so that's going to lead me to talk about that in a minute with regards to an analog of water injection. Excuse me. Today's seismicity lessons. Well, sometimes these fractures are connected to the crust. And when we inject and raise the reservoir pressure, we can actually communicate into the crust and lubricate those fault planes and cause a seismic activity. We're going to tackle this in Midland at our conference in December in a big way, and again in February at another conference on water injection. So big deal there. Strike slip faulting and liniments. I put this in there specifically because these sometimes are hard to see. These are horizontal moving liniments and faults, and sometimes don't have a lot of vertical throw, vertical offset, so they're hard to see with 3D seismic. What we've learned in our horizontal drilling experience is that they can be very, very important. Then, of course, there's the non-technical factors and things like how dense are the urban density in an area that you want to inject. Things like that probably will preclude siting for a secure storage site. There's other ones too, but that one in particular is one that we called out. Well, with all of those issues, I guess we should study, and I'm not arguing for that. I think that'll probably get us nowhere. We need to go to big scale injection projects, and we've done a lot of little ones. So we have some case history to rely upon, and so it's time to get moving. And we want to capture that CO2 and take care of it. But how dangerous is it to rely on small volume injection analogs? Now we've done a lot of work in the US DOE on sequestration and geologic storage in many parts of the country. And small volume is one thing, large volume is entirely a different matter. So the fast moving and recent horizontal well experience of our industry, as I was talking about, is creating a large body of information we can directly use for large volume CO2 injection. And it's from water production and water injection. And because we're able to make a low oil cut well economic with horizontal wells, we've got a lot of water. And if we don't reprocess for reuse, we're creating a large volume of disposal into reservoirs. And so we need to be paying quite good attention to that and use that in our assessments of the reservoir seals and the capacities of our reservoir to take CO2 in large volumes. And so we definitely need more confidence in small volume injection pilots provide. And then finally, where are the insurance companies going to land on this? Are they going to look at this water disposal and the issues of site characterization that we don't know much about in our reservoirs and run from this space? Or are they going to insure it? We don't know that yet. Clearly, they are insuring today EUR because we've been doing it for 40 or 50 years and they're comfortable with the database that's been established for the fairly large volumes of CO2 we've been injecting. So, well, we've obviously done natural gas storage, and it's a buoyant fluid. The methane is a buoyant fluid that we've injected and produced and re-injected. And with national oil repositories, we've injected oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Water floods, we've injected a lot of water and density neutral, and we've tried to balance the pressures in the reservoir, but it's a density neutral fluid. CO2 floods, the same story, but now we've been doing it with a buoyant fluid. And so these are our real 4 analogs that we've got on storage. Well, natural gas is intermittent. Some failures we've noticed in Illinois and are notable in Illinois and California. National oil repositories, we've moderate volumes and no failures. We haven't taken much out. It's been very low periods of time we've removed oil, but nonetheless, they've worked fine. Water floods, we've got a long history of water flooding, but it's a density neutral injection, and it's been quite successful. Very few examples of water migrating to the underground sources of drinking water or the surface. And then 50-year history of CO2 floods, and this is with a buoyant fluid. And these large volumes of CO2 storage we saw earlier in that shell graph. So our closest thing to secure sites with buoyant fluids is clearly the CO2 flooding experience. Back to the secure storage sites in those intercatonic basins. The examples of that today in the U.S. are the Permian Basin. In Canada, the Alberta Basin is a good example. Rockies and Intermontane valleys are good examples. Williston and Michigan Basin are also good examples. That's not an exclusive list, but it's one where we've had a lot of experience, and we're actually doing CO2 EOR in all 5 of those. Well, all right. There's a lot of people that will say all we're doing with EOR is just making more oil. However, we've got proven long-term and high-volume secure storage. We've got a long-standing regulatory regime in place, and now augmented with a subpart RR on reporting that the EPA has come up with. Mike Godek's going to address that for you here today. And unlike deep saline projects, EOR works on balancing the volumes in and out of a reservoir. And so that's just the nature of that whole process. And lots of experience there. Insurance companies, as I mentioned, they like proven track records, and this is one where they've been insuring for a long time. That subpart ROR that Mike will talk about is really all about better and more precise documentation of injected, produced, and recycled CO2. So, can we reduce the emissions of CO2 while making EOR oil? So, this life cycle investment world is how you can break that down. Nick's going to address that. It's really complicated and where you draw the fence around the project, and he's probably not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that part of it. He's going to talk about how EOR oil compares to normal oil and other oils around the world. And I want you to keep in mind that what he is going to present is what that LCA profile was for projects where the oil revenues were the only thing driving those EOR projects. The reservoirs, the retained CO2 in the reservoir and the CO2 purchases had to be minimized because that was the biggest cost. The CO2 purchases were the biggest cost in those projects. If you can add some value for storage, whether it be on a discounted price basis for the CO2 or maybe sharing in the tax credit that might come from 45Q, whatever, that can be a game changer here. In other words, we can do this in reservoirs that would not normally be a good CO2 EOR candidate with oil revenues alone. Can we design an EOR project to make a carbon neutral barrel? It might be the next question you ask. And let's dive into that one a little bit. And this is to use an example in the West Texas area. This is from near a project that Kinder Morgan put in called Tall Cotton, where they have about 300 plus feet of near constant oil saturation that's not mobile in the reservoir. Water's mobile in this reservoir, but yet there's about 25 to 45% oil saturations, and it's really in the middle of this section, it's nearly constant. And so we call this a greenfield EOR project, and it's also been called ROZ, residual oil zones, that we're dealing with here. So let's dive a little deeper into that. Historically, we have only flooded the upper part of these green fields, and so that's going to be because we didn't have any value for CO2 storage. That's where the oil is very mobile. It's a little bit higher in oil saturation perhaps, but we call it do-rods, or depressuring the upper ROZ, where the gas in the oil expands and we are able to produce it when we depressure the reservoir. Now, over here on the left, these net utilization factors. And so what Nick's going to present is one where we've got about a 6 to 10 MCF per barrel. In other words, buying 6 or 10 MCF for every barrel we produce. And that really pertains to this upper section right here. If there's enough economic drive from storage, we might extend that down to another 100 feet or so, and do what we call the very good EOR target, but a less efficient one. In other words, it doesn't make as much oil for every MCF of CO2 you buy, 10 to 18 maybe. And then likewise, there's an immiscible zone down here because the oil properties have changed, and we might even be able to do entirely 300 plus feet in these ROZs in West Texas. And so now the question is where are the economics of this, and so how much of this can we do? And this is an enormous amount of CO2 you can store in a project that would go down 300 feet. The properties of the oil change, as I mentioned. You got a decreasing gas oil ratio with depth. You've got decreasing water salinity with depth. You've got increasing oil viscosity with depth, and increasing minimum miscible pressure with depth, and the decreasing formation volume factor that most engineers use in their analyses. So those are examples. This is kind of geeky. This is rock porosity, by the way, and this is the natural gamma log right here. So you can see it's all carbonate, very little shale involved in these sections. So let's talk volumetrics, and we're getting close to the finish here, and I want to talk volumetrics with you in the best sites first. You may have seen this early this year that Exxon proposed some Gulf Coast projects that would capture lots of CO2, maybe put it in the subsea offshore Gulf of Mexico. A good site perhaps, but a lot needs to be known about those sites. And how big is that? Well, Exxon floated the proposal, and it needed to be public and private because of the size of the investments required. The petrochemical plants would capture their CO2 and bury them deep in the Gulf of Mexico. And Exxon would want to sequester up to 100 million metric tons of CO2 per year. That's equivalent to 5 BCF. That's, twice what we do at EOR today around the country. And they would do it under the Gulf of Mexico waters, subsea, and required about 100 billion or even more from companies and government agencies to capture and store that 50 million metric tons by 2030. And hopefully with a capacity that could double again by 2040. And this was Exxon's review, that 50 million metric tons is equivalent to a TCF, total CO2 stored. So where does that fall on our shell graph? Well, here we are. It's just a little bit higher than our experience to date, and about 100 million metric tons a year. I think that was 2040, as I recall on that previous slide. And so we've got a big chore ahead of us. This is a lot of CO2 in the Gulf Coast, as you might imagine, with all the petrochemical plants in Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama and the like. And so we've got an enormous challenge ahead of us where we've got to jump this capture and storage up significantly by 2050. So that 50 billion cubic feet a day of injection required by 2050, scope those numbers. What we've done here with this slide is we've looked at the voidage of the reservoirs we're creating by producing oil today in the U.S. We remove and sell about 10 million barrels of oil a day from our reservoirs in the U.S. And in that process, most of that comes from, I would say 90% of that comes from reservoir depressuring. We're not adding fluids back into the reservoir, we're just producing fluids out of them. That's where the best economics lie. And so we're creating a voidage equivalent to 500 million metric tons a year. So 1/2 of that gigaton a year target that Shell had by 2050, we're creating reservoir space for CO2. I thought that was really an interesting analysis to think that, you know, we've got all of these spaces, reservoir voidage spaces to fill up with CO2 when those projects go uneconomic. So the question then comes to mind is, should we target our pipelines from these big volume capture sites to the secure sites where we know we could repressure with CO2 and store this for long term? Here's an example of a pipeline network that we presented at MIT back in the 2010 or 12 timeframe. We call it the Horseshoe Pipeline, as you see up here in the Ohio River Valley, coming down to Jackson Dome down into the Gulf Coast. And then these hypothetical connections here, not only the Ohio River Valley Pipeline, but also this hypothetical connection out to the West Texas network of pipes. And then maybe even connecting up into Wyoming and North Dakota and even Canada, where we've got existing pipes, but we need some interconnects. And so this is just one example of many. There's the Carbon Capture Coalition has some others that are very, very useful to look at as well. We have an ethanol plant region in the Midwest here that's got lots of CO2 going in the atmosphere from smaller ethanol plants, and they need to be captured and put somewhere. And there's three projects that have been talked about in the press, one going into North Dakota, one going into Illinois, and another one going into Nebraska. So there may be one that would come down to West Texas. These are ideas that are floating right now out there in the press. So this takes me to the summary. Okay, we've established, and I hope Mike has established this with you as well as my slides early on, that energy reliability is fundamental to the economies of the developed world, and we need CCS. And I think we can do it successfully in appropriately screened sites. No question about it. The storage risks are many, and many sites will require exclusion. And that puts a lot of pressure on the regulators. I think Mike Godek's going to address this a little bit in his presentation. And it's not a comfortable place to be. Tell somebody they can't store CO2 underneath their plant site. But there's a lot of places that will need that exclusion. The upfront investments are immense, and so you really do need to understand you've got a low-risk secure site before you spend that money. But fortunately, proven sites are available, and we've got lots of them that could handle these kinds of volumes. The current secure storage in the U.S. is about 50 to 60 million tons a year, but it's going to require 15 or 20 scale up by 2050. The existing network of pipes can be used, and that'll help lower the overall investment cost. However, the long distance pipes will be required, new ones will be required, and additionally required storage sites that will be networked in. And secure storage is proven, and expansion to the volumes needed is feasible. I really strongly believe that an existing well-designed executed CO2 EOR project can create a low carbon oil, and with enough economic incentive from storage, even a carbon negative barrel. And Nick's going to talk a little bit about that. When incremental value for storage is considered, CO2 projects can produce that very low carbon oil. Retaining large groups of geotechnical professionals for secure storage is a necessity. That should go almost without saying, but probably the oil and gas industry is where a lot of those, and it needs to be central to this whole world to know we've got secure storage sites. So that's all I've got. I'm going to hand it back to Mike. If you don't mind, I'm going to plug our conference where we're going to address a bunch of this. It's our 22nd annual this December in Midland. And we've got a host for our field trip of Oxy Permian to West Seminole Field. And that's, I hope they talk about it, but I think they've got in mind to make that a CCUS project. And then Carbon Management Workshop on Tuesday and Wednesday. We'll talk a lot about these details that are fleshed out here today. And then some case histories on CO2 EOR and CCUS. We're all about real world data and not a lot about hypothetical ideas and plans. So that's what our conference has been about for the 22 years we've been involved. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be in front of you. Mike, take over, please.
You bet. Steve, thank you very much. A lot of detail there, a lot to digest. We've got some questions coming in that you've provoked, which are good ones. But we'll hold those to the when we're finished up and go into a Q&A session. For those that are paying on now listening, we're not gonna, if the depth of Q&A is there to warrant it, we will probably exceed our 3:30 cutoff time, just so that there's not like this sense of hurriedness to get something accomplished before 3:30. We're going to be touched on a few things and have already that will provoke some discussions, and we will encourage that when Nick finishes up with his piece there. Next speaker is Mike Godek. Mike, I see you're up and ready to go. And here we're going to get into some of the nuances of the Class 2 and ways that Class 2 is used for storage, whether it's MRV for EPA or the ISO standards, and then also the Class 6. And there's some unique nuances that are best explained by somebody like Mike and the role he plays in the middle of all that and what he gets to see. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mike Godek and let her rip.
Hey, Michelle, can I share my screen?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'll fix that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, there you go.
Okay. I can't find my.
Should be a small icon in the bottom right-ish corner.
Yeah, I know. What the problem I have is the thing is, there we go. There it is, got it. Okay, thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction and the invitation to speak here today. Thank you to USEA for providing this opportunity for us to talk about this. I think it's a very important issue for a lot of people in the energy space here in the United States as well as around the world. And I want to thank Steve for doing an excellent job in setting this up and kind of laying the foundation for much of what I'm going to talk about. What Steve talked about is really, what we need to do. And what I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about is how do we do it? How do we take advantage of these incentives provided by the tax code under Section 45Q? And how do we maneuver through the process to get the regulatory authorities to feel comfortable that we're addressing all of the issues that Steve raised in his presentation? So I'm going to talk about these frameworks. I'm going to talk about the process. Again, like Mike said, you could spend a whole, a couple of days just on this. So it's a very high level overview, but I think it's important to understand where we're going to do. So successful implementation of CCS or CCUS, either way, however you want to describe it, will require addressing environmental regulatory issues and keeping abreast of emergency policy issues. And these are rapidly changing, or could be rapidly changing. First is, of course, and most importantly, taking advantage of the 45Q tax credits. However, in order to take advantage of the 45Q tax credits, you have to demonstrate that you are putting the CO2 into what's called secure geologic storage. And there's a couple of ways that I'll talk about by which that can be demonstrated. Then you have to, obtain, the rights to put CO2 in the ground, to construct the wells, to inject the CO2, to operate those wells. And that involves complying with a couple of different regulatory regimes depending on how you were doing it. Class 2 really applies to enhanced oil recovery projects where you're storing CO2 in association with the production of oil. And Class 6 injection is where you're injecting CO2 purely for the objective of storage. Now, there's a number of efforts kind of going on right now to incentivize CCS and CUS. So currently, of course, and what we talked about, the most prominent is that which was included in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, which has provided a number of enhancements to Section 45Q of the Internal Revenue Code. There are also incentives in California that are in place to incentivize storage of CO2, and they can be quite lucrative if you're successful in doing that. And there's state incentives as well. I am going to focus today on the 45Q incentives just because Mike didn't want me to talk for 4 or 5 hours. So just basic economics. This is a very simple illustration that in order for CCUS to be economically viable, or CCS, the cost of capture has to be less than the revenue you get from credits in EOR, the sales you can get for CO2 EOR, and less the cost of transportation. Same thing with saline storage, except you don't have the revenue from selling CO2 to an EOR producer, but you do have credits, you do have saline storage charges, perhaps, that you have to pay to put the CO2 in the ground. And in both cases, you have to get the CO2 from where it's captured to where you want to store it. Now, in 2018, there was a number of things that were done to the 45Q tax credit that enhance their applicability, but also create certain challenges. The first challenge is that any new facility needs to, quote, break ground by the end of the year 2025 to be eligible for the credit. Now, it was 2023 end of year, but it took the IRS almost 2 years to implement the regulation, so Congress was able to extend that break ground date by a few years. The credit goes to the owner of the carbon capture equipment, but the legislation allows for the transfer of qualified credits. They dramatically increased the value of the credit. It's $50 per metric ton for geologic storage in saline offers, and $35 per metric ton for EOR. Those values are ramping up to those values in 2026, and then they continue to increase with inflation thereafter. The capture, in order to be eligible for credits under the current law, you have to be emitting over 500,000 metric tons of CO2 per year if you're an electric generation facility, and in most cases over 100,000 metric tons per year for other industrial facilities. There's some proposals in place in Congress right now to change that. And the final thing is, and this is really important, is the credit is you're only eligible to credit for 12 years. 12 years after the carbon capture equipment is placed in service. This is not a credit good for the lifetime of the project as currently written. It's really good for 12 years. And so in most cases, people are trying to demonstrate economic viability, payback, so to speak, over a 5-year time frame. So there's a number of issues of concern. One is 12 years enough for commercial viability? What kind of business models are going to evolve given the fact that these credits are transferable, that the owner of the capture equipment may not necessarily be a tax-paying entity where credit doesn't have any value, so they're going to have to transfer that. What is the role, or what might be the role, for the financial institutions and tax equity players in this? They're still sorting that out. The other issue is this deadline of construction for the end of year 2025. Can that be achieved? Can we break ground on some of these big projects by the end of the year 2025? Can the fact that the credit is available and it reduces the marginal costs of electricity dispatch, could that actually enhance dispatchability of power generation facilities that are, there's an echo in here from somebody and what impact that might have on dispatch. And then what if, and this is something being proposed currently in Congress, these crack credits are converted to jet pay. And there are a number of things going on right now in Congress that are being discussed. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's basically proposals going on to enhance the value of the credit, the period of time over which the credits will be paid, the period of time over which the credits, or the period of time within which you have to start construction. There's a number of things to kind of remove some incongruities in the tax code from different sections of the tax code, as well as a lot of in the infrastructure bills in particular, a lot of money being allocated to do more demonstration projects. So there's a number of things that may happen here in the next year that enhance the value and applicability of these credits, but you're going to have to stay tuned. And states are also stepping up. And what can states do? And states can enhance the federal incentives by implementing clear and supportive state regulatory policies, establish clear rules within their state regimes on the ownership and liability associated with injecting CO2 in pore space, enhance rules to ensure that CO2 pipelines can be built and have a common carrier status and are able to provide eminent domain, to provide additional incentives on top of the tax credits like severance tax relief or other kinds of things to also improve the financial viability of storage for those wishing to do that. So the states can play a big role here as well. But, you know, what do you got to do to get the credits? I've had clients tell me, oh, I just want you to help me get 45Q credits. Well, you know, to get the credits, all you got to do is claim them on Form 8933 and file them as part of your tax. Do that. But in order for you to get that credit through that system, the first thing you got to do is, like I said, demonstrate secure geologic storage. That is, you have to go through a process to demonstrate that you are doing all the things necessary to address many of the issues that Steve talked about in his presentation that are issues of concern, and that you're doing a mass balance, you know, that you know how much CO2 you're putting in, how much CO2 you're coming out, and how much CO2 may be leaking as part of the process. And the difference of all that is how much CO2 is getting stored in the reservoir. To get an MRV plan approved, you're generally going to have to get permits for all your injection wells. You're going to have to, not generally, you're going to have to get permits for all your injection wells, and whether that's class 2 or class 6. And generally, the MRV plans that have been submitted to date have already had those approvals in place, and then the MRV plan gets submitted after those approvals in place. So what I'm going to do now is just talk to you a little bit about how to do that. So one way of establishing secure geologic storage is submitting an MRV plan to the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program under what's subpart RR of that program. And the EPA has to assume, or has to certify your MRV plan in order for you to then be able to claim the credits. If you're injecting CO2 in association with EOR and storing the CO2, there's an alternative method to subpart RR, and this is standards developed by the International Standards Organization, or ISO. It's important to recognize that subpart RR is merely an accounting framework. It really is just what you have to do is show that you kind of know where your leaks are likely to occur, where your plume is likely to go, that you're addressing issues associated with leaks, but it doesn't require you to not leak. It just requires you to report if you do. Every year you do a mass balance, like I said, of what went in and what went out, and you report that, and if you don't store as much as you'd like, that's kind of oops, and that doesn't matter. Now, IRS cares about that because that's going to determine how much of the credits you get. But EPA is not enforcing storage under Subpart RR. They're just providing a mechanism for accounting in a mass balance kind of way. And then that's important. And Steve mentioned this, that that EOR is a closed loop process. That in fact, you inject CO2, some of it's recycled, much of it, and eventually almost all of it gets stored within the reservoir, even if you don't want it to. So over the course of a life of a project, you really store all of the CO2 that you initially require, or effectively all of that, other than what you might leak out to the surface or through surface equipment. And so it is really a pretty secure storage process. And EPA has issued a decision on that saying, yes, CO2 is stored and can be stored in effectively stored in association with CO2 EOR through the injection of CO2 through class 2 wells that are the CO2 wells. However, Subpart RR is not the only mechanism by which geologic storage could be established. There's also, as I mentioned, the International Standards Organization process and the California Lower Carbon Fuel Standards and its associated CCS protocol also have ways that you have to demonstrate storage if you're seeking low carbon fuel standard credits in California. And again, like I said, EOR is only, under Subpart R, it's only accounting framework, and EOR facilities don't have to report under RR. They only have to report under RR if they want to get credit for their CO2 that's being stored. If you don't care about getting credit, then you don't have to opt in, and you report under other subparts UU and PP of the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. The major elements of an EPA MRV plan is, one, you have to delineate what you think is the area of your plume, both the maximum area that you'll think you'll get to, and at any point in time, what's the area that you're kind of affecting now through your injection, because that's the monitoring that you need to do over the course of a project to see that your plume is doing what you expect it to do. You have to identify potential surface leakage pathways and describe how you're going to detect and quantify leakage should it occur from each of those pathways. As part of that, you have to establish a baseline against which your monitoring will be calibrated to determine the extent to which you might be leaking, if you are. And then you have to kind of define exactly how you're going to measure those variables at the site, which meters, which equipment are you going to use to calculate or manage what's going into the mass balance equation. After you have an approved MRV plan every year, you then have to report annually to EPA the amount of CO2 received, the data used to calculate that amount, and the source of that CO2. And then you have to include the values that go into the EPA specified mass balance equation, all the various variables in terms of CO2 received, CO2 leaked from the surface, CO2 leaked from equipment, CO2 produced. And from that, the difference is really how much CO2 gets stored. The International Standards Organization also has established a mechanism for demonstrating the safe long-term commitment of CO2 in association with CO2 EOR. Many of the same features are applicable in the ISO standard as were in the Subpart RR. And it has certain documentation provisions or containment assurance provisions and quantification provisions that a operator needs to meet if they use the ISO process. However, at least under current law, there's no requirement to get an ISO plan certified by EPA, that it's kind of a voluntary thing. But some claim that the ISO standard addresses concerns, particularly related to pore space ownership and surface rights issues that subpart RR doesn't address. So it's another mechanism. And then, like I said, there's also a third method, again, quite similar, but not exactly the same as both RR and the ISO standard. This is a standard of the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard CCS protocol that also has a set of requirements that you have to do, a little more prescriptive than ISO or subpart RR, and what's the kinds of things you need to do to demonstrate that your CO2 that's being injected is stored securely. Like I said, subpart RR applies to all saline storage projects. There's not an option there. And it only applies to EOR projects that choose to opt in. That is, they choose to want to certify that they're storing CO2. The ISO protocol only applies to CO2 EOR. It does not apply to saline storage. So you can only opt into ISO if you're an EOR project. And the LCS and CCS protocol applies to both saline storage and CO2 EOR. Like I said, subpart RR is purely a reporting requirement. ISO is voluntary, but it also cannot conflict with other existing laws and regulations. It can only become binding if some statute or regulation codifies it as binding, which is not taken place so far. And the LCFS CCS protocol applies to anyone seeking credits from California under the LCFS program, regardless of whether that project is in California or not. So in cases where you want to seek credits from both California and, say, 45Q, there's actually two regulatory regimes you'll have to comply with. The RR and ISO standards do acknowledge the applicability of existing regulatory programs. They are both performance-based. It says, here's the things you want to accomplish, but it doesn't say exactly what must be done to accomplish them. Under RR and ISO, there are no specific requirements for post-injection site care other than demonstrating that you believe the plume has been securely stored and is no longer posing a threat to groundwater or other surface resources. Under the LCFS protocol, there is a period of time, a post-monitoring period of time that could be as much as 100 years that could apply. So, but even in order to get, the RR plan, you also have to get the wells you're going to use to inject CO2 approved as well. And even though there's been 20 years of R&D on injecting CO2 into the subsurface, and provides a very good foundation upon which experience related to CO2 storage can be established. Again, smaller volumes, as Steve mentioned earlier, but still required. In 2010, the US promulgated what they call the Class 6 requirements. This is associated with wells used solely for the purpose of injecting CO2 for storage. So far, only two, all of the Class 2 CO2 EOR projects, Class 6, storage projects that have been permitted to date have been associated with R&D projects, even though Class 6 rules weren't originally intended to apply to R&D projects. And so most of the commercial scale CO2 injection that occurs to date has been through the operation and injection of CO2 through the Class 2 wells. And as I mentioned earlier, EPA guidance confirms that CO2 ER via Class 2 wells can result in stored CO2. And as long as your wells meet certain requirements under the Class 6 program, you don't have to convert to Class 6 in order to assure storage. But let's look a little bit about this in terms of what has happened, the relative activity associated with Class 2 and Class 6. As I said, Class 2 is associated with injection purposes for enhanced oil recovery. Class 6 is for sole CO2 storage. Approximately 140,000 wells in the United States have been permitted under the Class 6 program. 2 have been certified under under the Class 2 program, 2 have been certified under the Class 6 program. Right now, about 70 million tons per year are being injected in Class 2 wells. Only 1.3 million tons per year, roughly, are being injected in the 2 Class 6 wells. Right now, 40 states have primacy for regulating injection into Class 2 wells, and only 2, Wyoming and North Dakota, have the primacy for regulating injection under Class 6 wells, so several others are in the application process. For a Class 2 well, it generally takes 1 to 3 months to get a well approved. Nobody knows for sure how long class wells are going to take, but the speculation is it could take somewhere between 1 and 3 years to get a Class 6 well permit application approved. So to date, the experience with Class 6 is it's been very long, a period of time to get a Class 6 permit to date. In some places, over 4 years it's taken to get a permit approved. There's certain provisions in the Class 6 regulation that says by default, the plume has to be stabilized and you have to demonstrate stabilization over a 50-year period. There are mechanisms by which one could go to the state regulatory authority or the federal regulatory and say, I think my plume is going to be stabilized below that, but that 50 years is a pretty scary concept if that's going to be applied as a default for post-injection site care. There's requirements for demonstration of financial responsibility under the Class 6 regulations, but it's still not completely clear what kinds of financial responsibility demonstrations will be satisfactory for the various regulatory bodies in perhaps various regulatory jurisdictions. The process of getting primacy has taken a long time for the 2 states that have primacy so far. That has been slow. There still is a little bit of uncertainty associated what would happen if you stop injecting CO2 for enhanced oil recovery and want to continue injecting CO2 in a depleted reservoir for purposes of secure storage. What exactly is the mechanism for converting from a Class 2 to a Class 6 and what may work? And so there's a number of issues where greater certainty is required for Class 6. But it's kind of hard to say if these are problems or not until we actually do some projects and begin testing the system. So I think that there's plenty of opportunities to prove, and I believe that this process can work, but it's going to kind of, the devil is going to be in the details in the demonstration. In order to get a Class 6 permit, you have to demonstrate that the injection zone is of sufficient areal extent, thickness, porosity, permeability, and salinity to receive the total volume of CO2. You have to demonstrate that your confining zone, the seal above the reservoir into which you're injecting, is free of transmissive faults and fractures, and that is of sufficient areal extent and integrity to ensure the storage of the same of the injected CO2. You have to identify all underground sources of drinking water above the storage formation that are less than 10,000 milligrams per liter, and ensure you have mechanisms to demonstrate that that injection zone will not migrate, CO2 in that injection zone will not migrate into any USDW. And you have to demonstrate that your injection pressures will not exceed 90% of the fracture gradient that is estimated to exist within a reservoir. You got to maintain, again, Steve mentioned this as well, that pressures for injection are such that you won't be harming the integrity of the reservoir. A Class 6 permit application has a number of different features. Here's a summary of the various plans that have to be submitted as part of a Class 6 application. So there's lots of detail and extensive characterization that goes into a Class 6 permit application. And Steve and both Steve and Mike Moore said that this is, operators haven't done this yet to any great extent, but neither have regulators. And so, there's both limited developer experience and limited regulatory experience associated with permitting Class 6 wells. So everybody's kind of learning as we go. There are concerns that exist that maybe, if there's going to be a rapid increase in Class 6 permit applications and in fact, even Class 2, are the regulatory agencies responsible for oversight staffed to a level to be able to handle that incoming deluge, perhaps, of permit applications? There are efforts being pursued in Congress and some states to increase staffing to try to help regulatory agencies, staff up to meet the demand of applications that are anticipated. And there's also efforts underway with the Groundwater Protection Council and others to develop training resources for agency staff to give them the tools, the knowledge, the experience and expertise that are required to evaluate all of the aspects of what goes into a Class 6 permit application. So in conclusion, the recent incentives, 45Q, the California local standards and other initiatives has created a buzz that associated with CCS and CCUS in the US. And this is coupled with strong and increasing levels of R&D to demonstrate the feasibility of capture storage in a variety of technological and geological settings. However, substantial challenges remain. There still needs to be a little clarity on 45Q implementation. What will IRS accept? Again, this is going to be pretty much what IRS determines is acceptable. Since there's lack of a track record for expediting approval for CO2 storage, that creates a lot of anxiety on what will be necessary to certify and quantify the volume stored. And then as I mentioned before, are the timelines both for beginning construction and for getting the credit long enough to ensure that commercial viability for storage can be achieved. However, all that said, I personally think these challenges can be overcome, that CO2 storage in both saline aquifers and EOR operations can be viable and achievable within the existing regime. And the only way to make sure to demonstrate that process is to kickstart projects and get this deployment underway. So with that, I am done. I thank you very much for your time, and thank you, USEA, for your attention.
Mike, thank you very much as well. And a lot of detail in there and what you've given. And while I just off to the side here very quickly, we've got two likely developments of offshore CO2 storage in Texas state lands and Texas state waters. Do UIC permits, are they applicable on offshore lands if it's state or federal? And it's just a question that I hadn't thought about till just now.
They are applicable in state waters.
Right. So if I go,
so if you do the Texas, pore space lease,
Yep.
in that particular case, the EPA Class 6 and the EPA monitoring requirements apply. The federal offshore still remains a little uncertain. They're still trying to sort out exactly what regulatory authorities apply.
Right. We don't want to we don't want to go down that rabbit hole today.
No, not now.
to be resumed.
Yeah.
So with that one, thank you very much again. We've got a few questions starting to come in. I'm going to ask the questioners to be patient. And when we finish up with Nick, who's waiting now online with us, then we'll open up. And I've got three questions that are worthy to ask. And we got one question that seems, you'll see him if you call it up. Nick Azalina is our next guy coming up. Nick, thank you very much for taking the time I know that you're traveling, so this is a bit of an inconvenience to do this while you're probably in between flights and at an airport or wherever that it's probably not the most comfortable place to do a pop from. So again, thank you very much. And you have some great expertise that's hard to locate. So we'll go to great lengths to accommodate you here. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you now, Nick. And if you can, when we're done, be available for the Q&A. That'd be great. If you can't, I fully understand. And go from there. We're good on time. It's yours.
All right, great. Can you hear me okay?
You bet.
All right, thanks. I apologize if there's any occasional background noise. I found the quietest place I could in Minneapolis here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I believe Michelle was going to share the slides from her end because I'm unable to do that simultaneously from my phone.
Yeah, give me one moment. I'll let you know when they're up.
I don't quite see them yet.
The president's executive order requires all individuals to wear an acceptable face covering.
One more second.
To stop the spread of germs, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention also recommends social distancing and frequent hand washing. Please keep 6 feet.
Okay, we're up.
Okay, terrific. We can just jump to slide 2. Super, thanks very much. So I'm just going to touch on a fairly narrow topic here, talking about the low carbon oil production from CO2 EOR. And Steve touched on the concept, and Mike did as well. And so what I'm hoping to provide is a little bit more substance there to explain why producing oil with captured CO2 results in a lower carbon oil production. So I want to just get some terminology out of the way, review the difference between dedicated and associated storage, and I'll explain what we mean by those two terms, and then give the physical explanation for why incremental oil produced via EOR with captured CO2 is a lower carbon oil, and then highlight a few additional caveats because this is a high-level presentation. You know, there's always caveats. So next slide, please. So I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence, but we're all starting perhaps at different places with life cycle analysis. And sometimes I find I go too far down the path and I'm using terminology that isn't common, and there's a misunderstanding there. So I just thought I would get us all on the same page here with some basic terminology. So for life cycle analysis, at least with respect to greenhouse gases, we commonly track 3 gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. But in order to keep things simple, we want to express those as a single number. So we often speak in terms of CO2 equivalents or equivalents. And all that means is we multiply the concentration of each of those gases by what their assumed 100-year global warming potential is, which are published values from IPCC or other sources. And so CO2 is given a value of 1. So if we measured those 3 gases, we would take CO2 times 1, methane times 36, and nitrous oxide times 298. We sum it all together, and now we're in equivalents. So whenever you see that little EQ subscript, or sometimes it's just an E, that means it's more than one gas expressed on an equivalence basis. And then when we're talking about carbon intensity of a product, we usually take the mass of those equivalents and then express them per some unit of product. So if we're talking about the power sector, it might be kilograms of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, or in the oil sector, it could be kilograms per barrel of oil. Sometimes in the peer-reviewed literature, the SI approach is to take that denominator and put it on an energetics basis. So they'll For example, if they're running the calculations for gasoline, they might take the megajoules of energy in that gasoline, and then to keep things in whole numbers, express them as grams per megajoule. So these are all sort of similar. They're just different re-expressions. The main point is it's an inventory of greenhouse gases expressed on some unit of product. Next slide, please. Thanks, by the way, for advancing this. So Steve had distinguished in his talk between CCS and CCUS, and I agree with that distinction. The terms we've been hanging on those are dedicated storage and associated storage. Dedicated storage just means we capture something and we're storing it in a deep saline formation. In other words, there's no other in-between process. It's just a capture and storage project, CCS. And for life cycle analyses for these types of projects, the math is relatively easy. And so I'm just showing a little cartoon here on the left. And every coal plant is different, but to keep the math simple, I normalize this to 1,000. Let's say prior to capture, the plant is emitting about a metric ton of CO2 equivalents per megawatt hour, 1,000 kilograms. Now we install 90% capture. It's not quite as easy as just taking 90%. There's some additional emissions because now the plant needs more coal and you have to add those in. But at the end of the day, it's about an 85% net reduction. And it's very easy to show that that power plant with capture is generating electrons that are a lot greener than they were prior to capture. And so I don't think there's any confusion out there about how to go about these calculations or the result of those calculations, that coal plants with capture are a lower carbon intensity than coal plants without capture. But on the next slide, where there's massive confusion is in associated storage. And here's what we mean by that. Historically anyway, prior to today, the goal was not to store CO2 in the ground for an EOR project. The goal is to make oil. However, a tremendous amount of CO2 gets stored. And so we've been referring to that as associated storage. It's incidental to the EOR process. Again, historically, in the future, there may be a reason to intentionally store more. But where this gets complicated is now, if we're using captured CO2 in that process, we have a little bit more complicated system diagram. So over on the left, and we're not going to go into super detail on life cycle analysis, but I just want to highlight some of the pieces. Now we have upstream emissions from the coal mining, coal plant, and transport of CO2. We have whatever was going on, what we call gate to gate. That would be the EOR field itself. And then the downstream emissions associated with crude oil transport, refining, and ultimately combustion of finished fuels at their point of sale. But the tricky part here is all the way on the left, there's a box, electrons going to the marketplace. Something I call the Highlander principle. There can be only one. When we have oil in the system and electricity in the system, the accounting gets weird. And so life cycle analysis has some formalisms for addressing that. But even after you go through all of that process, you do a proper system model, you account for electricity and oil in the system, and you go through to assign the CI value to that oil, you still end up with a lower CI value because of all the associated storage. And I want to explain a little bit about how can that be, because there's just so much misinformation that has crept up over the past couple of years. And I think just two simple slides will help everyone keep it straight. So the next slide, please. So I thought it was kind of funny, Steve, Mike, and I didn't really review each other's slides prior to this, but they were amazingly synergistic. But we all seem to have a slide that says something to this effect. So we must clearly all want to get this point across. So if nothing else, a key takeaway message is that well over 95% of the purchased CO2 is stored in the reservoir. Somehow, over the years, it had been confused with a different metric, and people were saying 50%, but the value is well over 95%. As Steve mentioned, that's only not 100% because of occasional flaring that must go on, and there's a strong incentive to not lose CO2, and that's because, as both previous speakers have said, the CO2 EOR system is essentially closed loop. So there is some small fraction of the injected CO2 that's produced with the oil, but it's separated, recycled, and re-injected, and it is a closed loop system. And so if we go to the next slide, please. So what does that mean? And here's where I think it's good to just start simple, and I want to spend some time on this particular plot. The way one of the metrics for CO2 EOR is the net utilization rate, and that is the amount of purchased CO2 per barrel of oil produced. And most commonly, we talk about that in terms of MCF per barrel. So on the x-axis here, I have different values of the net utilization rate, 6, 8, 10, so on, all the way up to 20. But then on the y-axis, I'm showing that expressed in terms of kilograms per barrel. And the reason I've done this is this. If you take a barrel of oil and you assume that all of it is combusted, in other words, we ignore what small fraction might go into other petroleum feedstocks or things that don't get combusted. We assume the whole barrel is combusted. The estimated emissions from that are about 430 kilograms per barrel. So if you start going from 6 to 8 to 10, you'll notice that what I'm showing here in the yellow diamonds is at some point between 8 and 10, I'm storing more CO2 in the reservoir than is being emitted by the combustion of that barrel of oil. And so the 0 point is about 8.3 MCF per barrel. And the long run average in the Permian is somewhere right around that number. However, I want to stress that the historical data, as Steve touched on in his presentation, people were not trying to store CO2. They're trying to minimize that net utilization, in fact, to make the flood more profitable. If you somehow incentivized using more CO2 to produce that barrel of oil, then we keep marching over to the right. So for example, if you were to go over somewhere around 16 MCF per barrel, 16.6, I guess, to be exact, now you're storing twice as much CO2 in the reservoir as would be emitted from combusting that barrel of oil. So this is a very simple concept, but I think it shows just how powerful the associated storage is in neutralizing the combustion of the oil. So if we go to the next slide, please. I only wish it were that simple, but that piece is a major component of understanding the net result. If we're doing a life cycle analysis and we're adhering to the formalisms of that approach, then we have to add in upstream emissions and downstream emissions and go through a whole additional set of things that really just keep adding emissions to the numbers that I showed on the previous slide. However, even if you do all that, you still end up with an oil that has a lower carbon intensity than other oils that are produced. We had called it green oil. I don't know, I heard a term blue oil. I don't know what color we're in. All I know is the number is lower than the other numbers. And so what I'm showing over to the right is a bar chart of the carbon intensity values of a number of different oils from a fairly extensive and recent study by Cooney and others. The Department of Energy, National Energy Technology Lab, they have a whole life cycle division. and they do excellent work, and they're very good. And so I just took their appendices to create all the gray bar charts, except for the last two. And that's why I have EERC results there. I don't want to convey that those last two bars are anything that Nettle did. I'm just showing where our work falls relative to those other oils. And so we came up with an average estimate of what incremental oil, or a high estimate of what incremental oil with captured CO2 might be, and then a low estimate. A low estimate would mean that the operator, ignoring economics at the moment, was incentivized to store more CO2 and use a higher utilization. And so you can see this incremental oil is a much lower carbon intensity. And so by getting these projects going, as the share of the US oil consumption coming from incremental oil produced via CO2 EOR grows, you're going to lower the carbon intensity of the entire oil consumption. And so this is the main point that I wanted to make, that after you go through all the calculations, you still end up with a lower carbon intensity oil than the traditional sources of oil. And then I just have one last slide here with a couple of caveats. So I've obviously simplified what can be a complicated process, and every system is a little bit unique. You know, as you move geographically throughout the United States and you assess different systems, the numbers change. This isn't a one-size-fits-all thing, but the conclusions generally hold depending on where you're at. The upstream CO2 source makes a big difference. So whether you're tied into a coal-fired power plant or some other type of CO2 source can affect the calculations. A lot of the work we've done is focused on coal-fired power plants. Two of the more important drivers are the capture rate and the net utilization rate. So, you know, a lot of our work is done at 90% capture, which is a fairly standard value, and that really affects the results. And then the net utilization rate. The work we've done has mostly used long-run averages mirrored after the Permian Basin. But if those were to increase because there was an incentive for the operator to store more CO2, that would drastically change the results and make the oil even have lower carbon intensity. And then, as I already mentioned, you know, if the share of the total oil produced and consumed includes an increasingly larger share from the CO2 EOR, the net effect will be to decrease the carbon intensity value of oil as a transportation fuel and for other uses. So with that, that's all I had to discuss today. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Nick, thank you again for taking the time out during your travels, and I really appreciate the insights that you bring out here. And as we mentioned, as we started this up, we're going to get down into the weeds. And our assumption was for the community that would be watching what we would talk about today, there was going to be a certain amount of familiarity with a lot of the kind of higher level issues around CO2 and storage. So we really didn't try to address CO2 storage 101, but kind of moved into the deeper depths of it. With this, we'll go into the Q&A, and we've got several that have posted that I've got. I'll go through those first, and maybe we'll approach some as we get into the dialogue. This is to the three of you. The question is from an anonymous ask, but that's fine. It's a relevant question. There has been some research in the past regarding the storage of CO2 in fractured volcanic rocks, where there would be naturally occurring mineralization of the carbon, forming carbonates over time. current focus seems to be entirely on putting CO2 into sedimentary rocks where mineralization will not help keep the carbon in place over long time spans. What was the reason for turning away from volcanic rock formation storage? And I'll do this. I'll ask you, I'll just go down through the three of you, 1, 2, 3. So Steve, a response to that?
Sure, Mike. I guess, we entitled this webinar is First Mover Long, Big Volume, Long-Term Project. Right. And we did that on purpose because we think that the challenge is immense, as you saw from the volumes involved. And so we looked pretty hard at areas where we could handle those big volumes.
Right.
And then sort of concluded, I think all three of us has sort of concluded indirectly at least, that we know more about sites that we've had CO2 injection into, which should shorten the time frame both from a regulatory permit and from a insurance point of view. And so what my conclusion was that, yeah, we may end up knowing that we can store volumes, maybe large volumes, moderate volumes in other sites and securely do that. But I don't know that there's enough known about that to make them large volume first mover projects. And I'll just kind of leave it at that.
I think that I'll throw one more word behind that. It's not that they're not there. Is that the commercial feasibility is less likely right now. As doing additional work and testing to confirm the size and veracity and capacity probably is yet to be completed. Whereas these other areas, there's both been the practical work that's been going on for decades, plus the research work under the regional carbon partnerships, Carbon Safe, and then some of the other stuff has given the confidence to these other broad, larger scale size of storage areas that we know about. Mike, you care to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I'll add to what you guys have said is that these non-sedimentary settings are pretty localized. They're in certain areas of the country, but whereas sedimentary basins, both carbonates and plastics, are much widely distributed and much more widely distributed. So I think it's in terms of just the amount and number of CO2 projects that could take advantage of that particular opportunity is just much more geographically diverse. That does not say, because there are areas where there's good non-sedimentary storage prospects where there's not good sedimentary rock. So that doesn't mean that it doesn't work, but I think, it's the devil and we're kind of focusing right now on the devil we know a little bit more before we go to the devil we don't know. And also, where are most of the sources relative to the geology that you would like to put that CO2 into?
Gotcha. And Nick, do you care to comment on that from your work with your affiliation up at EERC?
I don't really have anything beyond what you guys have said.
All right, great. Well, I didn't want to take it, assume that you didn't want to say anything on it. So,
no, I appreciate that.
You bet. So, Steve, this is directed to you, and it's actually Niraj. It appears that secure storage is mainly feasible for CO2 EOR in oil-producing areas as a question. How about other deep saline formations such as Mount Simon in the Midwest? They've shown containment and retained brines over geologic time.
Well, and that's a great point, and thank Niraj for it. That question. One of the advantage Mount Simon's has is the thickness involved. I worry about thin sandstones being used for large volume first mover projects because of the worries about lateral continuity. But I think maybe in the Mount Simon special case, it's a thick zone, and we've got some pretty large, let's say moderate size injection projects that have occurred there, a deep saline project. So it's in the game from for sure. I know the North Dakota folks have looked at the Deadwood Formation, which is an analog. One of the worries that I think our water experience tells us is that if we get close to the crust with that injection, we got to start worrying about lubricating the crustal faults. And, you know, when you're increasing pressures, you're moving fluids deep, and then you can generate some seismic activity. It's a research area too, though, that we're trying to understand, and it's emerging. I've got Mark Zobak coming to Midland in December to talk about the experience from Oklahoma, the Fort Worth Basin, and now the Permian Basin and seismicity. So, yeah, those are questions that need answers.
And don't disagree. Mike or Nick, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that you know, it's in all cases, you're looking for good thickness, you're looking for permeability, and you're looking for porosity. And if you can find those three things with a good ability to contain, and as he says, far enough away from the base rock that you're not going to be concerned about seismic stimulation, that's good. As you well know, Raj, we're very bullish on some of the formations down in the Gulf Coast Southeast region as well, and those have the same kind of characteristics. The Biloxi, the Washita Fredericksburg, the Tuscaloosa sands also are thick, permeable, porous, and have lots of opportunity that are not in oil fields.
You know, Sheila, just for to ask, with what's been going on, and you travel in a wide range of circles that are through the membership of USCA. Any of the things that we've been discussing, that our speakers have been talking about, and even some of this Q&A, have you had any of these kind of conversations with people that, you know, we're talking to people that kind of down in the weeds in the field on some of this?
There have been some, but it's been a very sort of broad energy policy. And there's been some dismissives, you know, don't bother us with that stuff because, you know, we're not interested in it. I've been amazed at the willingness to listen, certainly with those who are involved in USEA, to listen and to learn. I have been concerned outside of the USEA world that there has been a dismissive reaction in certain circumstances that has been, well, you can see it certainly with all of the debate and dialogue and all on the plan, on the administration plan, that there's some that just say, you know, look, we don't even want to talk about this because this means that more oil and gas will be developed worldwide, and you're giving this as a solution, and we don't see it as a solution, and so on and so forth. I've been amazed at the hardcore that just doesn't even want to hear about it, because they've already made a decision on the basic issue. But there's so much to learn, and there's so much that can be done, and other countries are pursuing it because they want to reach the climate goals and so on. But I've been amazed that there's a real wall of resistance in some quarters, not even a willingness to hear out how it works and how it could improve improve things CO2 wise worldwide. But obviously, if they were to listen to this panel and understand it, and actually have an open mind to considering solutions to not just a US problem, but a worldwide problem, whether you could go Africa, China, Russia, wherever. These are issues which could be dealt with in a meaningful way to resolve a lot of the issues that have certainly hit center stage.
Sure, appreciate those insights. And again, you get to see and travel in areas that are well outside where we're at here today, but it all is very applicable with the people and some of our members. And like you said, there is that resistance, and sometimes you get a crack in the door. It'll take some time to listen.
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Mike.
Oh, sure, of course. One of the other things that happens in this space, and I made that comment before we started out, that it may be that what happens at the end of the pipe is the most important part of the whole process. Because if it doesn't work at the end of the pipe, and these are decade-old processes, it's a problem that you can't close the door on. You got a lot of other pieces upline that have been put into place to have this end of it not work. It could be a disaster. So incredibly valuable part. Like any other valuable business process, there's amount of risk that's in there. There's amount of financial responsibility. There's the investments that are made. There's people who have made those investments. There's a certain amount of that risk you try to lay off in the commercial processes. One way we do that is with certain types of liability insurance, and I can go down the list. And this isn't going to be any different than any other industrial process with shareholders, with investors, with stakeholders that have a financial risk, an environmental risk, and a process risk, supply chain risks. How do we insure that? You know, I go get car insurance, and there's a rating scale of whether I'm a good driver or not. They can figure out what kind of a premium to charge me based on a zillion pieces of data that they've got, people driving cars in my kind of bracket. What do we do here? Or are we doing this here? And if we are, it'd be great to know who's doing it.
Is that a question?
That's a question to the table.
All right. Let me start. I mean, I think that you make a point, but I think that the issue here is fundamentally one of experience. And then that there's certain aspects of this that we've never done before. It's really hard to develop an actuarial table with no history. Part of the trick, I think, is take the pieces apart and begin to say there's some front end process pieces, there's some things that we do that are quite normal, and can we base that on something that we know, break it up both in terms of components of activity and periods of time, and begin to layer in kind of liability expectations and or concerns over time. I mean, there's lots of studies that show, for example, if a storage complex is going to leak, it's going to leak early when it's under the highest pressure and the highest rates. And over time, as you begin to demonstrate its integrity, the risk should go down because you know more about it. You have more data, you have more stuff. And we can begin to develop projects, processes and insurance products that take into consideration how the risk changes with different components of the process and at different points in time in the process. And I think that's going to be critical. However, it's really hard to do, of course, without having any projects to kind of put under your belt to really make the demonstration.
Mike, if I could change the subject a little bit.
Sure.
A couple of things that I wanted to bring out. The urgency of doing this, I think, is pretty widely felt around the world even. And so one of the reasons we wanted to talk about large volume secure storage was, and first mover projects, was because of that urgency. So we have time, hopefully, to add our confidence, experience, as Mike said, on other sites, but we don't, you know, we are going to have to wait. And we got to qualify a bunch of regulators, as both Mike and I said. And I hate the pressure that's on their shoulders. I really am sympathetic to, well, in fact, I was talking to Louisiana, and they have 40 to 60 projects on their desk right now asking for deep saline storage. And how in the heck do they handle that? And it's a bit scary because we could put it in the wrong side and have a large accident that basically shuts down the industry. So that's kind of one message I wanted to give. And then on the positive note, I wanted to shout out, we haven't said it, but the Great Plains Institute and now the Carbon Capture Coalition, which formed out of C2ES and the Pew Foundation, have had really done yeoman's work in the legislature on getting 45Q passed. And I just really wanted to give them a shout out because that's created this momentum. And I don't know what we'd do without it, frankly. And I hope it gets amplified too in the current legislation. and they're working hard at it, I know.
Well, to add to that, it looks like Brad Crabtree, who's the kind of the guide to this process with originally NERI and then the Carbon Capture Coalition, has been nominated by President Biden as the next Assistant Secretary of Department of Energy. So there'll be an opportunity for him get through confirmation to see a lot of this stuff through and continue forward. David Merchant has a couple questions. Effectively, one of them is about the estimate of how long would it take to get a Class 6 permit. I'll qualify that. Each state is going to be different before anybody tries to answer that. And and the other issue is going to be is if the state's got primacy and it's going to be in a location that makes sense for that permit to be issued, it could probably be expedited. If it's in a state that doesn't have primacy, then it's going to be up to the timeline and resource capacity at EPA to prioritize it and get it done through the process, as well as what kind of physical location will that permit go. The other one, there was a broad question from David. It was about anything in the infrastructure bill. And the answer to that is there are things in there, and we could spend a day walking through pieces that are meant for one thing that can be used for something else. There's also stuff in the reconciliation bill as well, which is very fluid right now. So wouldn't comment on what's on the reconciliation bill, again, as it's all in negotiations. Ed Rubin asked, again, what are your current estimates of the cost per ton of CO2 stored in a deep saline formation and EOR reservoirs? Well, Ed, we've all been in this space for quite a while. And I think the fair response is it depends. You have so many variables for each one of those mediums that'll have an impact on what that cost might be for storage. And if you're in a state that has where the state takes over a certain amount of the liability after you've begun to store it and you pass muster with the state and they've got primacy, like Wyoming and North Dakota, or states like Louisiana and Texas that are in the process of asking for primacy, the permit costs could vary, and the long-term liability costs could have huge variables on them as well. So that's probably kind of the fair response to a very, very broad question. Look forward to more from you. I think,
Mike, if I could go back to
please,
David's question about length of permitting.
sure.
We haven't mentioned that there's several factors involved in that. Obviously, the regulator, whether it be EPA or the state with primacy, is going to require a certain amount of site characterization data. And that area of review will very much depend upon that length of time. Obviously, for a small footprint project, say maybe, let me use an ethanol project, for example, that timeline, I've heard one state talk about this as being less than 2 years for that information to get to them and them to process the primacy request or the permit request. But if it's a large project like the ones we've been talking about, that are probably 1 million tons a year larger, then that area of review is much larger, and that site characterization data is going to have to be more thorough. And so I've heard a number of less than 5 years, but not much, less than 5 years for that process. Now, I don't want to quote that as an average going forward, because obviously the first ones are going to be longer than the later ones. Mike, you got to have something.
Yeah, no, I'd like to just elaborate on that. There's two pieces of this. There's the time spent in preparing the materials to go into the application. And that is strongly a function of how much detail you need. And then there's a time spent within the regulatory agency trying to decide whether that's enough. One of the things that the agencies are doing, and I've been active in this already on a number of projects, is really trying to encourage applicants to meet with the regulatory authorities prior to the submittal of their application. So they make sure that what's being submitted is what the regulator is expecting to see. And when the state of Louisiana says we have 40 in the hopper, that means they've met with 40 people that have ideas to do stuff. Only a few of those are actually in the permit application submittal stage. So the other thing that's really important, and this is something that I've been showing to people myself, is the role of government R&D. Many of these areas, through the carbon sequestration partnerships, through a number of the feasibility studies that have been done under Carbon Safe, through a lot of other projects, have done a lot of that characterization already. And you have a strong body of information to start with, thanks to the investment in R&D by the federal government, that you need to build on at a site-specific level, but in fact, the foundation already exists. And so, when you talk to certain people, and Nick can certainly answer this probably better than I can for North Dakota, they think they can approve these things in less than a year, whereas EPA is saying, 1 to 2. But of course, that depends on how many they get. They can only do so many at a time in sequence, and multitask as best they can. So the volume is going to affect that. And so, it's a little bit of a wild card, but everybody knows and everybody appreciates that if it takes too long, the 45Q credits are moot. And nobody wants to be the reason that failed because they couldn't get a permit. So I think that the regulators are going to try as hard as they can within their authority to move these as quickly as they can, because they recognize that if they don't get them done within the time frame for 45Qs can start construction, then it doesn't matter. They've wasted their time too.
Good points on that. At this stage, I don't have any additional new questions that have come up from outside. I've had everybody here, and Nick had to make his move. We've been on for a good solid 2 hours and change. I think what I might do is, Sheila, is if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make, being part of this with us today.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to our outstanding speakers that gave so much depth and insight and sophistication to this discussion, which really put it in terms which you really can wrap your mind around and understand the significance of it and how it could solve so many problems that confront the world today. The question is, how do we get people to listen, and how do we get buy-in from governmental entities and other entities to implement wholeheartedly? And that's something that we are 100% in favor of and would like to support in any way possible. So, Michael, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. It's a privilege to share a few minutes with some great minds.
Okay, well, some kudos go to Michelle for making sure some of these connections were made and that we'll have you here and things like that. And I want to highlight a little piece for Michelle. I think it's worthy here, is that she gave a talk to a class on fashion, and CCUS came up in the discussion. And it's not something I never made that kind of connection. And of course, what is a lot of the synthetic cloth made out of are usually fossil fuel based products that have been turned into the threads that go into this. And you learn something new every day. And Michelle, that was pretty cool. You were able to go do that. So,
Michael, you're never going to be asked to do the fashion bit.
No, I'm not worried. So I think with that, I'm gonna do my piece. Steve and Mike, thank you guys very much. Nick, if you can hear us, if you happen to be listening in, certainly want to thank you all a lot, very deeply a lot, for the time and effort spent. And we put this together on fairly short notice, so it meant a lot of scrambling. Everybody's busy, so I know that you had to take extra time, plus a couple hours today. So thank you. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn this to Michelle, and we'll call it a day.
Thank you, Mike.
Sure, sounds good. Well, as Mike said, thank you all for being here and joining us. We had a pretty great turnout today. Everyone's presentations are going to be on the webpage. Recording will be up there, hopefully by today, if not early tomorrow morning. And yeah, we're looking forward to seeing y'all again. We tend to have some of the same people with different combinations, I suppose. So if we can make that happen in the future, that'd be wonderful. And yeah, thank you all very much. And thank you to Sheila for being here and Mike for making sure everyone was talking about the same thing.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you very
See
much.
y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.